Hello. Do you know who you are? From favorite pastime to socioeconomic status, there are lots of things we use to identify ourselves. Today, we're going to look at one of the newest versions of one of the oldest forms of identity, genetic ancestry. To start, genetic ancestry is the process of finding information about your ancestors through genetics. Most people are familiar with the process: see a commercial, ask a question, buy a kit, spin a tube, mail it in, wait for magic, receive an email, and make a YouTube video with your results. A solid formula, and I can't argue with the results, but it's not exactly my style. However, any sufficiently explained magic is indistinguishable from technology, and curing ignorance through STEAM is my style, so we'll start with the science. In most cases, when your saliva is sent into the lab, the technicians run it through a process known as genotyping, not to be confused with sequencing. Genotyping is like a 20-piece puzzle: quick, cheap, easy to do, and you get an okay picture. Sequencing is like a 3,000-piece puzzle. It takes forever, costs more, not everyone can assemble it, but the picture is so much better. The first step of genotyping is to make multiple copies of the DNA in a sub-process known as amplification. This step is to amass enough DNA to be processed because the original sample is often quite small. Next, the DNA is cut into smaller pieces and applied to a microarray, which is a tool used to detect the expression of thousands of genes at the same time. DNA microarrays are microscope slides that are printed with thousands of tiny spots in defined positions. Each spot contains a known DNA sequence or gene that matches one of the genetic variants that are being tested. The pieces of your DNA stick to the DNA spots if they share the same genetic sequence. This bonding is what is used to determine if you have the variant that is being tested. Or in terms of our earlier analogy, it's like lining up the puzzle pieces with the reference image on the box to make sure you have all the right pieces. Unfortunately though, there are limitations to the knowledge that can be gained from this process. The largest and most notable issue is that this process requires a reference sample. These reference samples are created by matching people with similar traits and then finding the chunk of the DNA that most likely causes these similarities. A sound method in theory, and it's pretty successful for the most part. But correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation, and most traits are controlled by multiple chunks. Checking some chunks can give you a good idea of if a trait will manifest without the steep price tag of checking every chunk for each trait, but it's far from a guarantee. Another major issue with respect to genetic ancestry is that the aforementioned reference samples have to come from somewhere. Each company has to go out and get raw genetic data from each area they want to connect ancestry for, and this data has to come from people who know their family are native to the area for multiple generations, which is notoriously hard to do given these. Also, because they catalog and compile similarities in the reference samples to get an idea of what traits are native to a specific area, several bad samples can disrupt the validity of the entire process. On top of all this, there's the fact that quite a few European countries didn't have their current borders 200 years ago, and most African and Asian countries were formed with no regard to cultural and ethnic divisions. Lastly, one might want to consider the fact that each company uses a different reference group and DNA chunks, so results can vary widely depending on what company you go with. Now, with all this information in hand, you might ask, Crow, isn't this a science? Shouldn't it be more accurate? How much French is an Englishman if his granddad is from Paris? Well, for that last one, you can be as French as a half French man or as English as the Queen. We can discuss the statistics and misconceptions of how genes are inherited another time. For now, let's focus on the first two questions. Is genetic ancestry a science? Well, only Sith deal in absolutes. Before we can touch this question, we need to first define science. Mr. A made this diagram and a video that explained the difference between science and pseudoscience way better than I can. I highly recommend you check it out when you're done here. The important thing to note for this particular situation is that genetic ancestry is based on solid scientific principles and processes. But the current commercialization of this science is giving people unrealistic expectations through cherry-picked results, uninformative advertisements, and under-researched endorsements from friends and family. Real science is slowly being corrupted into pseudoscience for profit, much like astronomy and astrology. In short, genetic ancestry has the potential to be an interesting field of science, but only if we shield it from corruption by understanding its limits, building its strengths, and curing our ignorance through STEAM. Made it through the video without even mentioning how most people's concept of genetic ancestry is just a form of polished racism. I'll definitely be happy about that.
I just want to let you know all of our sources are down below, and if you'd like to see this topic covered in far better detail by people way more skilled than us, feel free to click one of the links to my left, your right. And thank you for watching.